How would you have described your dad?
Really funny guy. That was my best friend.
Do you think that your humor is similar to his or different?
I think our humor usually tends to come from our siblings and parents. That's usually where it and also the region in which we grow up.
You know how Neverland always appears in our imagination. A private amusement park, a Ferris wheel spinning under the California sun, a zoo filled with giraffes and elephants, a working train rolling through the property, a full movie theater, everything a child could ever want, a real-life fantasy land that looked like pure magic. Most people looked at that place and thought the same thing. Michael Jackson's kids must have lived in a dream every single day. With that kind of wealth and those endless attractions, who wouldn't want to be one of his children? Free to run, free to play, free to do whatever they wanted. But at 28 years old, Ferris Jackson sat down in a podcast and told a completely different story. She didn't describe a childhood of unlimited fun. She revealed something far more surprising, a set of strict, almost harsh rules that applied even to the king of pop's own kids. In her own words, "I didn't grow up there." And the line that hit the hardest? It was made very, very clear that all of the attractions there were not for us. Today we're going deep into the truth Ferris just shared, the real rules, the real discipline, and the real life that existed behind the fairy tale image of Neverland. If you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next might completely change how you see one of the most famous places in the world. Chapter 1. She didn't really grow up there. Ferris Jackson sits across from the host, calm but deliberate. At 28, her voice carries a quiet certainty when she begins talking about the place the entire world still romanticizes. She does not start with the Ferris wheel or the animals. She starts with a simple correction. "I didn't grow up there," she says. "It was only the first few years of my life that I was there." In those early years, mornings at Neverland never started the way most people imagined. There was no laughter rolling across the lawns, no distant sound of the train, no children already running toward the rides while the grass was still wet. Instead, the day began quietly inside the house. Soft morning light came through the windows, pale and calm, stretching across the floor in long, slow rectangles. The air still felt cool from the night. Outside, birds called softly from the trees. Somewhere far away, a peacock cried out. But inside the room, the sounds were different. The scrape of a chair being pulled in, the soft thud of books opening, the low, steady voice of a tutor. This was the classroom. Ferris sat there as a little girl, the only daughter of Michael Jackson. She had been born into a life full of noise and attention, yet these mornings were deliberately quiet. Michael had full custody of his children. He was the one who shaped their days, and even though he had built an entire fantasy world just beyond those windows, a private park, a zoo, a train, he still made sure their mornings started with school. There was no rushing outside first, no free play before the work was done. The lessons came first, always. You can almost see her there, a young girl at a desk, the light slowly moving across the floor as the morning grew warmer, the extraordinary world of Neverland waiting just outside while the ordinary work of learning filled the room. The contrast was quiet but powerful. Outside stood everything a child could dream of. Inside, a simple rule held firm. First the classroom, first the responsibility. Only afterward would the rest of the day begin. Ferris would wake up, get dressed, and go straight to that room. No wandering the grounds first. No running toward the rides while the grass was still wet with dew. School came before everything else. She and her brothers were homeschooled. The classroom was not a makeshift corner. It was a real space set aside for lessons, desks, books, structure, the same routine every day. She describes it without drama, almost matter-of-factly. You can almost see the scene, a young Ferris sitting at a desk, the light shifting slowly across the wall as the morning advanced, the quiet concentration of children who already understood that play was not automatic. The house itself was enormous, filled with the kind of stillness that large estates often have in the early hours. Distant footsteps, the soft mechanical hum of air conditioning, the occasional creak of wood. But the children's world, at least in the beginning of the day, was reduced to that one room and the work in front of them. Discipline came first. Learning came first. Freedom, when it arrived, came later, and only under conditions. This was not the wild, unstructured childhood many imagined for the kids of the King of Pop. It was ordered. It was intentional. Even at a young age, Ferris absorbed the message that the extraordinary surroundings did not mean extraordinary permission. There is something almost cinematic in the contrast she draws without ever raising her voice. Outside those walls stood a private amusement park, a zoo, a train station, a movie theater, everything designed to look like pure childhood fantasy. Inside, a little girl sat at a desk while the morning light moved slowly across the floor, completing her lessons before she could even think about the world beyond the classroom door. She does not claim the place was cold or unhappy. She simply refuses the myth. Those first years at Neverland were real, but they were not the endless playground the public invented. They were shaped by schedules, by expectation, by the understanding that even in a place that looked like magic, certain things still had to be earned. And that understanding, she makes clear, was only the beginning. The surface details of her early routine, the classroom, the morning light, the quiet insistence on school before play, were just the first layer. Beneath them sat a deeper set of rules. Rules Michael Jackson repeated so often that they became the central line of her childhood. That is where the story begins to turn. Chapter 2. The Rule That Never Changed. Ferris leans forward slightly when she gets to this part. Her voice doesn't rise. It just becomes clearer, more deliberate, as if she's repeating something she heard 100 times as a child and still carries with her. She calls it the cool, very congruent line. That phrase sticks with you the moment she says it. Not a strict rule shouted across a room, not a punishment, just a steady, consistent principle that followed her and her brothers wherever they went. It started at Neverland and never really left them. The content of the rule was simple on the surface. If you're good, if you do your chores, if you do your homework, if you do the things you're supposed to do, then and only then, on the weekends you can go see the animals, you can go ride some rides, you can go to the movies. That was the deal. Fun was not automatic, fun was earned. But Michael didn't stop at the surface version of the rule. He made sure the children understood something deeper, something that cut straight through the fantasy the outside world had built around their home. Ferris repeats his words almost exactly, the way a person repeats a sentence they were taught to never forget. It was made very, very clear that all of the attractions there were not for us. That did not belong to us. That was for underprivileged children and children that were terminally ill that couldn't go to Disneyland. Listen to that again. The Ferris wheel, the train, the zoo, the rides that looked like pure childhood magic. None of it was theirs. One afternoon, the light was already turning gold across the lawns when Michael brought the children outside. They stood near the edge of the property where the rides were visible in the distance. The quiet shape of the Ferris wheel, the empty track of the train, the stillness of the park before any visitors arrived. Ferris was still small. Her brothers stood beside her. The air smelled like dry grass and sun-warmed wood. Michael didn't raise his voice. He rarely needed to. He simply looked at the attractions and then back at his children. "Those are not for us," he said. The words landed softly, but they stayed. He explained it the way he always did, carefully and without drama. The rides, the animals, the whole park, none of it belonged to them. It had been built for other children, children who were sick, children who had almost nothing. Children who would never walk through the gates of Disneyland, who would never stand in those long lines or see those bright lights. "This is for them," he told his kids, "not for us." Ferris listened. The Ferris wheel looked enormous in the late light. For a moment it felt strange, to live so close to something so magical and still be told it was not theirs. But Michael's voice made the boundary clear. The park was a gift meant to be shared, not a private toy for the children who happened to live inside the gates. He repeated the lesson more than once over the years, sometimes in the quiet of the house, sometimes while standing in that same golden light with the rides in the distance. The words never really changed. The most famous private amusement park in the world did not belong to them. It belonged to the children who needed it more. That single teaching rewrites the entire public image of Neverland. People always imagined the Jackson kids waking up and treating the place like their personal playground. In reality, the playground was locked behind a principle. The children could see it. They could hear the distant sounds of it. But they were taught from a very young age that those attractions existed for someone else first. Picture a young Ferris finishing her schoolwork in that quiet classroom, the morning light still moving across the floor. Later in the day, there would be chores, real responsibilities. Only when everything was done, only when the week had been lived the right way, would the weekend open up the possibility of the animals or the rides. Even then, it was never presented as an entitlement. It was presented as a privilege that had been granted, temporarily, because the work had been completed. There is something almost radical in that approach when you hold it up against the myth. Michael Jackson was one of the most famous, most successful entertainers on the planet. He had built a literal fantasy land, and yet the central lesson he gave his children was that the fantasy did not automatically belong to them simply because they lived inside it. The rule created a clear boundary between what was around them and what was theirs. It also created a quiet emotional weight. Every time they were allowed onto the rides or into the zoo, they were reminded, directly or indirectly, that other children were the intended recipients of that joy. The experience came with a built-in perspective. You are fortunate, but this was never designed primarily for your fortune. Ferris describes the consistency of this message as something that stayed with her long after the family left the ranch. The principle didn't depend on the location. It depended on the values Michael kept repeating. Do the work, earn the reward, and never forget who the attractions were truly meant for. That is why the line felt congruent to her. It didn't change when the scenery changed. It didn't soften when the family moved. It remained the same quiet standard running underneath everything else. In the public imagination, Neverland was a symbol of excess and pure childhood wish fulfillment. In the private reality Ferris describes, it was a place where even the most magical parts of the property were placed behind a moral framework. The rides were real. The animals were real. The sense of wonder was real. But the ownership of that wonder was deliberately withheld from the children who lived there. Michael did not want his kids to grow up believing the world owed them the extraordinary simply because they had been born into it. He wanted them to understand that the extraordinary was something to be shared, and that their access to it came with responsibility. That is the heart of the rule Ferris keeps returning to. Not be good so you can play, but be good, do your part, and remember that what looks like it belongs to you was never really yours in the first place. That distinction is what makes her account so striking. It doesn't erase the beauty of Neverland, it reframes it. The fantasy was always there, the access was always conditional, and the deeper message, the one Michael repeated until it became the central line of their childhood, was that privilege without awareness is hollow. Ferris doesn't deliver this part of the story with bitterness, she delivers it with clarity. The rule was consistent, the teaching was clear, and even now, years later, she can still hear the exact wording of the lesson that shaped how she understood the place the world called a dream. Chapter 3. The rule traveled with them. The family left Neverland, but the rule did not stay behind. Ferris is clear about this part of the story. There came a stretch of years when they rarely stayed in one place for more than 12 months. Hotels became temporary homes. Suites replaced bedrooms. The scenery changed constantly. Different cities, different weather, different windows looking out onto different streets. But the structure of their days remained almost identical to the one they had known on the ranch. Do the work, finish the chores, complete the homework. Then and only then the weekend might open a door. In Las Vegas, that door led to Circus. In some random stretch of Virginia, it led to Chuck E. Cheese. The destinations were smaller, more ordinary, almost ordinary enough to feel strange after the scale of Neverland. But the principle was exactly the same. Privilege still had to be earned. Fun still arrived as a reward rather than a right. Imagine one of those evenings in a Las Vegas hotel suite. The air conditioning hummed steadily. The curtains were half drawn against the neon glow outside. Michael sat with his daughter after the day's lessons and responsibilities had been checked off. His voice was calm, almost casual, the way it often was when he delivered the news that mattered most to a child. "You've done everything you were supposed to do this week," he told her. "This weekend, we can go to Circus." For a second, the room went quiet. Then Ferris's face lit up. She didn't scream at first. She just froze, eyes wide, as if she needed a moment to believe it. Then the excitement broke through, a sharp, happy sound, the kind of pure reaction only a child makes when something long-awaited finally arrives. She jumped up, maybe spun once, maybe grabbed his arm, the way kids do when joy arrives faster than words. In that moment, the hotel suite, with its temporary furniture and temporary view, felt bigger. The reward was not the towering fantasy of Neverland. It was a noisy, crowded family entertainment center with arcade games and pizza. But to a child who had been taught that fun was conditional, it felt enormous. The same scene played out in different cities with different names. Virginia. Other stops along the way. The pattern never broke. The children learned quickly that geography did not change the terms. Whether they were looking out at desert lights or quiet suburban roads, the week still had to be lived correctly before the weekend could offer anything special. Television and movies were controlled with the same firmness. There was no casual watching, no drifting into a show just because it was on. Screens were not background noise in their lives. Ferris remembers the limitation clearly. They were not allowed to watch television or movies freely. The only exceptions came under two conditions. First, on the weekends, and only if every responsibility had been met. Second, when they were studying film. Even then, the sound often stayed off so they could focus on the images, the framing, the way stories were built visually rather than simply consuming them for entertainment. That detail is easy to overlook, but it reveals a lot. Even leisure was turned into a form of learning. Watching was not passive. When it was permitted for study, it became work of a different kind. The children were being trained to look carefully rather than simply to be entertained. The overall effect of these years was a strange mixture of movement and consistency. The outside world kept changing. New hotels, new cities, new temporary addresses, yet the internal rules stayed fixed. Chores, homework, responsibility first, reward second, and always the quiet understanding that access to pleasure was something granted, not something owed. For a child, that kind of consistency can feel both grounding and restricting at the same time. The constant moving might have made life feel unstable. The unchanging rules, however, gave it a shape. No matter how many times the scenery shifted, Ferris and her brothers still knew exactly what was expected of them, and exactly what had to be completed before any reward appeared. Looking back, Ferris does not describe those years as chaotic. She describes them as continuous. The same line that had begun at Neverland simply kept running. The destinations became smaller and more ordinary. Circus instead of a private Ferris wheel, Chuck E. Cheese instead of a private zoo. But the emotional structure remained intact. Do the work, earn the weekend. Remember that nothing is automatic. Even the way television was handled reinforced the same message. Entertainment was not a constant presence in the background of their lives. It was rationed. It arrived only after responsibility had been fulfilled, or it arrived in the service of learning. In either case, it was never treated as an unlimited right. That is the picture that emerges from this chapter of her childhood. After the mythic scale of Neverland came a more ordinary, more mobile existence. Hotels, short stays, temporary addresses. Yet through all of it, the central rule never loosened. The children still had to prove they had done what was required before the world of fun opened, even slightly, for a weekend. And in those small, earned moments, a trip to Circus after a week of finished work, a visit to Chuck E. Cheese in a city they would soon leave, the same lesson kept being repeated. Privilege was conditional, joy was possible. But it always arrived after the responsibilities had been met. Chapter 4. The Masks and the Quiet Protection. There is one detail from Paris Jackson's childhood that still makes people stop and stare at the old photographs. The masks. Black cloth or simple face coverings pulled over the children's faces whenever they stepped into public. To outsiders, the images looked strange, even unsettling. A famous father shielding his kids so completely that their faces disappeared. Many people assumed it was extreme. Some called it paranoid. Others simply found it odd. Ferris remembers it differently. As a child, the logic felt clean and obvious. If no one could see her face, no one would recognize her. And if no one recognized her, she could walk into ordinary places and feel ordinary for a little while. The mask was not a prison, it was a key. Imagine a late afternoon in some city they were passing through. The hotel suite was temporary, like most of their rooms in those years. Michael knelt down in front of his daughter, the soft hotel lamp throwing a warm circle of light across the carpet. He held out the mask the way another parent might hold out a jacket. "Put this on," he said quietly. "Then we can go." Ferris pulled it over her face. The fabric was light but complete. Suddenly the world outside became possible. They could walk through a parking lot, step into a pizza place, or head toward an arcade without the weight of 1,000 eyes. For a short window of time, she was not Michael Jackson's daughter. She was just a kid going somewhere fun. That small freedom mattered more than most people understood. The public always focused on the spectacle of the masks. Ferris focused on what the masks allowed. A normal evening, a normal outing, the chance to stand in line for a game or a slice of pizza without the entire room turning to stare. Years later, when the podcast host asked whether she and her brothers had spent their early childhood running freely through the rides and attractions at Neverland, Paris answered with a short, dry laugh. "No," she said, "I probably would have grown up to be an asshole." The line is funny on the surface. Underneath it sits a clear-eyed understanding of what unlimited access can do to a child. Michael did not want his children to grow up believing the world existed for their entertainment. He did not want them soft, entitled, or convinced that magic was their birthright. The masks, the chores, the earned weekends, the constant reminder that the attractions did not belong to them, all of it formed a single protective system. It was not gentle in the way the public might have preferred, but it was intentional. So this is the picture that finally emerges when Paris Jackson, at 28, sits down and tells the truth about her early years. Neverland was never a private paradise reserved for Paris, Prince, and Biggie. It was a place of clear rules and clear responsibilities. The rides, the animals, the train, the theater, none of it was presented as theirs by default. Michael made sure his children understood that the extraordinary world surrounding them had been built, first and foremost, for children who had far less. Sick children, poor children, children who would never walk through the gates of Disneyland. The same principle followed them after they left the ranch. Hotels changed, cities changed. The rewards became smaller, circus, Chuck E. Cheese, but the structure never loosened. Work first, responsibility first, then and only then, a measured piece of fun. Even television was rationed. Even public outings required the quiet protection of a mask so the children could experience ordinary life without the crushing attention that followed their father's name. What Michael gave them was not endless freedom. He gave them boundaries, perspective, and a repeated lesson about privilege. The magic was real, the access was conditional, and the ownership of that magic was deliberately withheld so they would never take it for granted. Now the question turns to you. After hearing Paris describe her childhood this way, the classroom before the rides, the chores before the weekend, the masks that bought a few hours of normal life, do you think the upbringing was harsher than you expected? Or does it actually feel more thoughtful than the fairy tale version the world invented? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you land on this. If these deeper, more detailed stories mean something to you, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more conversations like this coming. I'll see you in the next one.